Latch the windows, lock the doors, and put the kids to bed. It's time for another episode of
Tales from the Garage!
Okay, I'm back. For you folks who may not know, maybe you weren't watching me at this time last year, I am a huge fan of Halloween. Actually, it's my eyeball, by the way, just fell out. It's pretty much the only holiday that I have any desire to celebrate. The only holiday that doesn't have any kind of depressing memories associated with it, or anything like that. So, and it's not a family thing because nobody in my family has any interest in Halloween besides me. I always loved it. I still do. Every year on my cable TV channel lineup, there's Music Choice has a channel called Sounds of the Seasons, and I literally count down the official start of the Halloween season. Even though I start celebrating before, the official start of the Halloween season actually comes when the Music Choice channel starts playing Halloween music, which is today, October 9th. It varies a little bit year to year, but roughly it's roughly around the 8th or 9th or 10th of every October. Sadly, only goes until October 21st. And I actually get depressed when it goes off the air on November 1st. And then they start playing Christmas music. And it's literally, I realize that I wait for this all year, and it's less than a 3-week period that the channel actually plays the music, and therefore it being, to me, the official Halloween season. I love Halloween, as you may be able to tell from the stuff on the back shelf there. And henceforth, I always take the opportunity, and I always get copyright notices, to, as I did in the beginning, put a little film up of something that's playing on the Halloween channel. They do all kinds of silly Purple People Eater type songs and things like that. vocal songs. They play Michael Jackson's Thriller about 3,000 times in this 2.5 week period. But they also play some movie soundtrack stuff and some sound effects similar to what you heard at the beginning of the video that I always indulge myself with at this time of year. I always stick at the beginning of my videos and make the people suffer through it. But for those who may not, I keep my old videos up. So last year's Halloween and the previous year's Halloween, I think I did one for Halloween the previous year, still out there and up. But I think a lot of people aren't necessarily going back and watching the old videos. And every year I tend to talk and show a lot of the same albums. But they're the things that I listen to this time of year for a couple reasons. Because I get the desire to listen to them because the season's coming and it helps get me in the mood. And it's just the one time of year that I pull out certain albums. Some of these are going to be quite evident what they are. And maybe for the sake of this is one that I don't know how I'm going to keep short. But I'm going to rummage through a bunch of these that I don't talk a lot about. Some of these are fairly obvious. There's a group, like I guess a splinter group, and I don't know from what orchestra, but they're probably orchestra musicians that kind of splinter off, mostly as string players, and they call themselves the Halloween Ensemble, and they do a classical Halloween haunting, which is something I only discovered a couple years ago. Strictly classical movie themes for the most part, or classical pieces that were used a lot in movies over the years. And it's interesting. I think this is a self-made thing. A lot of string quartet things. Actually, it's this way. Actually, they're one of the few groups that don't do. It seems they don't do any movie themes on here. They strictly stick to classical themes. And there's other things. Some of these, a lot of these have different recorded versions of the same pieces. Here's actually a compilation put together by Reader's Digest, one of many I have actually called Fright Night Classical Halloween Music. I just eat this stuff up. And the nice thing is, most of these classical compilation albums of Halloween classical music have a lot of the same pieces, but thankfully they have different versions of them. The Toccata in D minor by Bach, which is that famous organ piece. Everybody, the funny thing is whether you like classical music or not, you probably know at least 50% of the things that pop up on these. The Funeral March, like the things that were used for the theme for the old Alfred Hitchcock Presents show. Dance Macabre, which is my favorite Halloween piece, I think, by Saint Saens. I never knew how you pronounced his name. The Dance Macabre was a piece that was introduced to me in grade school, actually. It was a soundtrack to a little film that we would see every Halloween, and it was all of maybe 5 minutes. And it took me decades to figure out what that piece was. But it stands out. When you hear it, you know it, and you've probably heard it a zillion times, used in movies. Most of these themes have been used in movies since movies had sound to them, going back all the way to the 1930s, and they're still used today. TV shows, and I think for a lot of people might think that if you have a favorite movie, especially one that's Halloweenish or dark or has some dark classical music in it, a lot of times these pieces will be used, and people don't realize. People may think that the music was something that was written by a composer for the film, and probably be surprised at how many pieces that they actually know or are familiar with that are actually classical pieces that were written ages ago. Night on Bald Mountain, also known as Night on Bear Mountain, which is a Mussorgsky piece which is used a zillion times. Tons of stuff. There's actually this Reader's Digest one. He even has newer things like some of John Williams' music from Harry Potter movie. I guess it is Halloweenish. I'm not that modern, unfortunately. I haven't seen Harry Potter. In the Hall of the Mountain King is another one by Grieg. That's one that's been used for decades, or, that's ages old. Dream of a Witch's Sabbath from Symphonie Fantastique by Berlitz. And, of course, one that's a little more recent in terms of history anyway, Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells theme from The Exorcist, which gets I love hearing different renditions of that, even ones that are done on cheesy synthesizers. One of my favorite, you know what? I forgot a whole bunch of these that I've got. I'm going to have to do a part 2, I just realized, because I have a whole section that I forgot to go grab. I was so focused on grabbing the classical music things that I forgot to grab the storytelling things and the things that are not classical music. I have basically two or three areas where I keep these. So I'm going to have to do another one. You guys are going to have to put up with a lot of scary Halloween stuff. Okay, I'm going to have to call this one the classical edition for the most part, not exclusively. And then the next one is going to be more of maybe movie themes and audio ghost stories or something. Here's one called Fright Night. This is one of the first ones I ever bought. It's a very early compact disc that I bought too. In terms of, this came out in '89. It's probably one of the first classical music compilations that I bought of something for the Halloween season. And this one, for years and years, you would only see it come out at the record stores at Halloween time. After Halloween, they would put it away, and boom, it would come back out maybe in late September again. But this is another one, A Night on Bald Mountain again, Dance Macabre, The Hole of the Mountain King, March of the Marionette, The Sorcerer's Apprentice. So a lot of the same pieces get redone. The famous Bach Toccata, the Humperdinck, Witch's Ride, which is one that's maybe unique to this one. The Holst, Mars from the Planets. Mars is probably just about the darkest piece. It's not the only one I've seen covered from Holst's The Planets, but it's the one that gets the most versions of on these kind of Halloween compilation things. Wagner is on here. Charles Ives' Halloween, which is a piece that should appear on all of these, but appears on very few of them. And Mephisto Waltz from Liszt, and that one doesn't appear a lot for some reason. The next couple are also classical compilations. I'm just thinking now of how many that I've left behind, so it would have made the whole thing an hour and a half anyway. Witch's Brew, one of several that are titled Witch's Brew. I think this is one that's out of print now. But the thing with this one is, look, I'll buy it because it's like a Halloween compilation anyway, and it's classical music. But I tell you, I would have to have that for the cover alone. This one's great because they jammed 78 minutes worth of music on here. This one out of print, but if you could find it, this is one of the better ones, I think. There's something called the Narnia Suite on here, which is literally the only time I've seen the Narnia Suite kind of thrown on a Halloween compilation. It's an interesting little collection of short pieces. So this has another piece by Liszt on here. This is maybe one of the few that has something from Holst, The Planets. This is Uranus instead of Mars, so that's a little bit of a surprise. This one also has Dukas, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, Grieg, the Lyric Suite, March of the Dwarfs. Strange choice for a Debussy piece from Preludes, Book 1, a solo piano piece. That's a little odd. It's not a very dark piece, really. So it's got Mendelssohn's A Summer Night's Dream. That's another odd choice. Another version of Berlitz. Symphonie Fantastique, Dream of a Witch's Sabbath. That was also on the last compilation. Two Russian Witches, Baba Yaga, and Kikamora, which is one of the few places that those two pieces pop up. And they're very good from what I remember. I haven't played it yet this year. This is definitely getting on the list for, the next couple days. Another version of Mussorgsky Night on Bear Mountain and Dance Macabre is on here as well. This is one of the best. This is one of the best. it's just a great classical compilation, even if you don't, particularly want to hear things associated with Halloween. A lot of those themes, like I said, were used in movies, but there's a lot of unique pieces on that one, too, that aren't particularly dark. Here's another one called Witch's Brew, and this is actually essentially a compilation of two albums that came out many years ago, and I want to say the pieces are very old. From the recordings are old, not just the pieces. The recordings are apparently from 1959, 1964 as well. And it's a compilation of two albums. It's not two full albums, but it's a compilation of two albums that were essentially packaged and sold also way back then, like I said, 59, 64, as like Halloween-themed albums, but all classical rides. There's the Humperdinck Witch's Ride again from Hansel and Gretel, Dance Macabre once again, which is, you better like this piece because it's probably on all these albums. It's a good thing I happen to love that piece. Mussorgsky, an excerpt from Pictures at an Exhibition, which maybe now that to me seemed like an odd choice. The pieces from Pictures of an Exhibition, and maybe it seems strange to me because that's one of the few classical pieces that I actually knew before I bought these, in terms of hearing the piece numerous times in full, and not just as a movie thing or as something on a Halloween album. So, but there's a couple times that pictures or sections of Pictures of an Exhibition were used. It's interesting that it shows up again on this one. The Tam O'Shanter Overture by Sir Malcolm Arnold, Mussorgsky's Night on Bear Mountain again. I think I said that. Dance Macabre. It's another good one. And this is one that actually classical freaks like because having nothing to do with Halloween even, but apparently these versions from 1959 to 1964 of these classical pieces were very, very highly thought of and were only available on LP for years until this came out in, I don't know when the CD came out, probably the late 90s. So here we go. Once again, I was mentioning how I thought it was strange that Mussorgsky was put on a Halloween album. Well, this isn't really a Halloween album, but look at the cover. You may not be able to see it, but there's like a black cat up in the upper window. So even though this is not marketed and designed to look like a Halloween album, it kind of is because of the cover. And it's got a piece that I don't recall being very Halloweenish, but it was new to me anyway, by Balakirev composer. Tamara symphonic poem takes up about half of it, about a third of the album. But there's a full version, complete of Pictures of an Exhibition on here. The whole, I believe it's the whole thing. It's over a half hour long. But again, this one isn't really sold as a Halloween album. I'm showing things that I associate with Halloween, even though at times they are not Halloween albums. There's another version of Night on Bald Mountain on here. This time it's called Night on Bear Mountain. A couple other pieces by Rimsky-Korsakov. But to me, this gets spun at Halloween time, even though this one isn't marketed or sold really as a Halloween album. But that, to me, that cover kind of makes it kind of like a Halloween album, and I stuck it in my classical Halloween pile, so it always gets pulled out and played during the season. Here's another one that's obviously a classical album. Obviously, this one is marketed toward Halloween, and again, it's weird because these albums only pop up during the Halloween season, even though they're classical music, and then they get pulled off the shelves and don't come back again until maybe September. This is a newer compilation, I think, called Creepy Classics, a Halloween collection. You see the monsters in the graveyard partying. I have to read the pieces here. So this one has Holst once again. Mars has Dance Macabre. You can't escape it if you tried. Mussorgsky, once again, Night on Bald Mountain. Berlitz, Symphonie Fantastique. Dukas, The Sorcerer's Apprentice. Strinsky, something for the Firebird Suite. Now that's fairly unique, not really a dark piece. A Charles Ives piece here that's not Halloween, which is interesting that they didn't stick Charles Ives' Halloween piece on here, though there's a lot of Charles Ives pieces that are very avant-garde that definitely would fit on this album. Bartok piece, a music for strings, percussion, and celestia, which I actually just realized I actually have a full album of Bartok pieces that piece comes from. That piece isn't the piece for strings, percussion, and celesta. There's just the adagio from that. I have to listen to that. That never struck me as a particularly dark piece, but it's interesting what they do put on here. And this one's probably still in stores because it came out in the early 2000s, and it's on Sony, so it's probably all over the place. Now here's another one that's not really marketed or sold as a Halloween album because it really isn't. It's a Dvorak album, actually. But there's a piece on here. The majority of the album is the Symphony Number 8. But there's a piece on here. It's only about 14 minutes long, but simply because of its title, it gets played all the time in the Halloween season, and it is in my stack of Halloween classical CDs, and it's a piece called The Noon Witch. And like I said, it's only 14 minutes long, but it always gets played this time of year, and while I'm at it, I play the rest of the album too, which isn't particularly Halloweenish. Nice classical piece. I wouldn't say particularly dark, but it was actually written, I believe it's an old folk tale, the whole story of the Noon Witch, and the composer basically decided to do an instrumental instrumental storytelling of this old tale. Actually, it's the last of my classical things that I have here, at least for this video. There's no association whatsoever with Halloween or anything dark in particular, unless you've heard his music, and that is this one Arnold Schoenberg CD that I bought. This was for me to sample Schoenberg's music. Schoenberg's music is really dark and quite avant-garde, and I'm a little surprised after hearing this album that a lot more of it was not used in movies. And I mean, maybe it has been, but I imagine there must be somebody with enough knowledge of classical music out in Hollywood, and I don't really watch much Hollywood stuff, that would have thought to use some of Schoenberg's music, which is very dark and avant-garde, in suspense, horror, dark, fright movie things. And this is one that is very close to, it's not actually in my Halloween pile, but it's right by it because when you hear the music, it's dark and it fits in when you're playing all those other CDs, certainly. Well, here's another one that's classical that I kind of put in a completely different area too. And I think, and this is a newer one. I only got this within the last 2 or 3 years. Alberto Granados, somebody that I was not familiar with until I realized that some progressive rock bands, namely Emerson, Lake and Palmer, were stealing pieces of his and writing them into songs and I believe taking credit for them. He was a composer that died in 1983. And actually, a lot of his music is, for classical music, I would say very accessible, very pretty, but not pretty in a hollow kind of way. But I like his music as opposed to a lot of classical music that is too busy and there's too much going on and it changes too fast for my simple mind. But I bought this album because I'd heard a bunch of Ginestera's, or Ginestra, I don't know how you pronounce it. I sampled a bunch of his music on YouTube and really found that I liked it. And this album, Popol Vuh, mainly dark because of the cover. The music's not that dark. But I guess because of that cover, I've got that Halloween association. The Mayan creation is the primary piece on this album. And it's, again, this is something that I really recommend, just as a nice classical album. Not very dark. Now, I've got other albums that are not sold as Halloween albums, and not... They're things that over the years I've come to associate with Halloween, and I always play during Halloween. And one of them is Tomita's The Bermuda Triangle. You can guess why. It's the subject matter. This is I believe this was a Japanese CD, because I'm not sure. At the time, this one wasn't available on CD in America. The Bermuda Triangle is maybe a little bit darker than most of Tomita's pieces. So that's one that always gets played this time of year for obvious reasons. Here's another one that you may think really has no association to Halloween. Manuel Gotching, who's the leader and at times the only member of Ashra Temple, did a solo album called Dreams and Desires. I want to say, I think this was a movie soundtrack, recorded in 1977. Didn't get released until a number of years later. But there's 3 long pieces on here. It's a great album. All electronic music, all keyboard synthesizers and some guitar, some electric guitar. Really great album. You know, if you like Berlin music at all, the Berlin school of the 70s. I definitely put this in the top 2 albums that he ever did. But there's a song called Desire on here that I've talked about before, but you would have to go back over a year to see me speak about it. That I associate with Halloween and always gets a ton of plays because it has this ghost sound effect coming from the synthesizer that goes woo through the whole 20, almost 23 minutes of the piece. That sound is played on a synthesizer on a loop with all the other music that's going on. And I don't know what the maybe Manuel was just a sound that Manuel liked, and he put in the piece. It plays throughout the piece. But to me, I always have this vision of this ghost flying around back over this big, empty, dark field between 2 trees or something. And it sounds like a ghost going boo, and it's kind of cool. And from the first time I heard that piece, I always thought, that sounds like a ghost. I don't know what his intention was, but and from that, of course, it's going to get played during Halloween. Here's one, and with the imagery of Tangerine Dream, Green Desert. Now, to me, a desert suggests heat and dryness and everything, the total opposite of my imagery in my head of Halloween. Except there was one Halloween season a number of years ago, and I want to say it was over a dozen years ago, but I remember it very vividly, when it was this time of year, and I had this album for a lot of years, and I had only played it at various times prior to this one Halloween season about a dozen years ago, and I just got in the mood to hear it. Coincidentally, it was Halloween season, and I put it on the one night. I dug it out and put it on, and I liked it, and then I ended up playing it the next night, and all during the, in with the mix of me playing this album, amongst my normal nightly listening was all Halloween stuff, and this album, the Green Desert. And I ended up liking it so much, and for whatever reason, I don't know, I can't say this is really any better than a lot of albums of theirs from the period. There's just something about the mood to it that I like. It doesn't sound very desert-like to me, but I think simply because it was Halloween, and I played the album, and I got into this mode of, I was playing it every night. And every night at this Halloween period about 12 years ago, I was mixing this album in with all my other Halloween albums. I didn't really think about it, and once Halloween season was over, but the very next year, all of a sudden, when Halloween season came again, and I'm pulling out all my Halloween things to listen to, it's like I got the desire to hear this again. And that has now happened every single Halloween. It's simply because, I guess, of the timing of that. It's become a Halloween album for me. And now the music sounds very Halloweenish, but I don't think anybody else would think so if you played it. And just said, what does this album remind you of? I don't think it would be anything dark or spooky or anything. But I think it was just because that Halloween, I literally played it every night right up until Halloween and probably after, mixed in with all my other Halloween stuff. Here's one that I actually posted up because it's not a print album. I actually put on my Cosmic Pickle page. It's a soundtrack to a movie called Full Circle, The Haunting of Julia. It depends on what country you're in. I think in America it was called The Haunting of Julia, but I think in England it was called Full Circle. And it is a really spooky movie, not a horror, violent slasher thing. It's a ghost story, very well done, from the mid-'70s. Very spooky and atmospheric. And Colin Towns, who's an excellent keyboard and flute player, was hired to do the soundtrack. And I saw the movie. I don't think it was Halloween time when I initially saw the movie, but right away I noticed the score because it has some really nice analog synthesizers in the movie score. And I had to look it up. Ooh, who is that? And then I realized, oh, I know this guy from playing in rock bands that I listened to back when I was in high school. So I didn't realize that I actually knew the guy. And Colin Towns, still around, still making music. And I think he's done a lot of soundtracks now. And this is probably one of his earlier ones. And I'm glad I grabbed this. This one went out of print and got really expensive. And I actually did, on my Cosmic Pickle page, the soundtrack album is up. I don't know how obvious it is. I don't know if it's really a spooky soundtrack, but it always does remind me of Halloween. Here's one I listened to just today. Sergei, Gleaner. And this is one that I've had for years. I've never associated it with Halloween, but it's got a sci-fi edge to it. It's all synthesizers, all electronics. Some of it's very dated sounding because it was done in the 1980s, 1986 specifically. Not a good time for synthesizer music because the synthesizer sounded pretty crappy back then. But, and it's evident, there's a couple tracks that really do sound, that suffer because of the quality of the synthesizers that were around. But most of the other tracks, it's short. There's just short 5-minute tracks and under. And there's only 8 of them, so it's only a 30-something minute CD. But there's especially on the first track, that really establishes this weird kind of sci-fi feel to it. And it's one of those albums made by just one musician in the studio. I'm pretty sure there's no guests on this or anything. And it's interesting. And it struck me when I played it today. I said, oh, I think this is going to become one of the Halloween things. So I'm kind of glad in a way I didn't pull out my second batch of Halloween stuff. I have a couple albums that are fairly obvious that I bought in my youth. I didn't buy this as a little kid, though. Famous Ghost Stories. I bought this when I was maybe 19 or 20. This is a lot of fun. Just short versions of spooky stories. It's marketed toward kids, but there's only one really silly kind of track on here, and the rest are just somebody reading short versions of ghost stories that aren't really geared toward kids. It's fun. I'm sorry this one never came out on compact disc. This was on that old Pickwick label. I don't think Pickwick exists anymore. If it did, they probably would have stuck this on a CD. Be nice if it was on CD. And of course, something that is, if you can see my back wall at all, is in the back of a lot of my videos here. It lights out the old radio program. As you can see, one side has something, Murder Castle, broadcast on the radio in 1943. The second side has a program called The Witch's Tale from 1939 on the radio. It's incredible that anybody had these tapes around. And a little extra short story thing by Boris Karloff, broadcast on the radio in 1948. There's some history for you. Just really kind of cool. Obvious that those are Halloween things to listen to. Now, something that My buddy Carm spoke about this album recently, and he asked me to speak about it. So it's kind of, and you might think it's kind of weird for me to be talking about this on a Halloween, but Carm pulled out his, we got on a discussion of the two albums that Harold Budd and Brian Eno made together. And this was the first of the two albums, which came out in 1980. I believe it was recorded in 79. But this was, I was already familiar with, I bought this as a new release, believe it or not. This is the Ambient 2 album. So prior to this, there had been Ambient 1 music for airports, which Harold Budd doesn't play on, and Discreet Music, which was really the first ambient music album that Brian Eno did. So I was familiar with Brian Eno's work from there. So when he put out another album, Ambient 2, I jumped on it. And even though I didn't know who Harold Budd was, but at that point I was already familiar enough with Eno's music that I could listen to this and pick out what was coming from Eno and what was coming from Budd, even though Budd was completely unknown to me. This is my first Harold Budd purchase. And really this music is more Harold Budd than Eno. It's more Harold Budd on acoustic and electric pianos, and Brian Eno playing synthesizers and doing treatments to the piano, and maybe a little occasional voice in the pieces. But it seems like the majority of the music material comes from Budd, and then kind of Eno deciding what he can add to it after the fact. And I liked it right off the bat. And as a matter of fact, it's the thing that drove the only other available album at the time of Harold Budd's, because I could tell what was coming from Harold Budd, and I liked it, was the Pavilion of Dreams. That was the only other album out there available in 1980, because the Pavilion of Dreams was a record that came out prior to this by about a year or two. I don't know if that's 78 or 79, the Pavilion of Dreams. And that's a collection of compositions that Harold Budd wrote over the years, over a number of years, but just newly recorded. I believe it was for Brian Eno's label. So Brian Eno was a Harold Budd fan. And I'm pretty sure that that album, The Pavilion of Dreams, was actually produced by Eno. I know he gets a credit on there for doing something, and he doesn't play on it. So The Pavilion of Dreams was another winner for me. That's different compositions for different sized ensembles. It's not at all a solo album of like keyboard work or anything. But this is the one that really got me into Harold Budd, my introduction to him. It's what made me a fan. It's the thing that made me go on, and everything I got after that was never disappointed by. And so I gave it another listen. I don't know when the last time I listened to it was, a year or two maybe. And it did dawn on me that this fits in with Halloween. Now, maybe it's just the timing, but listening to it, I'd say most of the pieces are very slow, very minimal, at times very, very pretty, but also very sedate, very, very low key. So it's not like for the George Winston crowd, I don't think. Not pretty in that way. And some of the titles ended up suggesting things. Now, I've been familiar with the titles because, like, I've had this since 1980. But naturally, I have it on compact disc. At least once. I may have it on compact disc twice, actually. But some of the titles on here, there's one in particular called Wind in Lonely Fences, which always called up this image to me of an old wooden fence. Not a tall wooden fence, you know, those kind that go up maybe 3 feet off the ground and have those two, like, slats going across them. Doesn't, you know, really prevent people from jumping over them or anything. Kind of these old, broken down wooden fences that just separate one piece of land from the other, but there's nothing on either side of the land except for grassy fields. And it always, and the title of that piece always called up that image to me, Wind in Lonely Fences. But playing it this time of year, I realize that not only that piece, but there's others on here, but that piece has a slight dark edge to it. And it fits. It fits this time of year just perfectly. And I can't say with a dark edge to it. I don't know how obvious it would be to people just really casually listening to it. Now, this whole album is all over YouTube as single tracks, as a full album. So, numerous people have put this album up there. But simply because Carm was speaking about it and the whole Harold Budd thing, Brian Eno came up. And he did his recent video on it. And it really... I put it on, and of course now, it's Halloween season, and I just heard these pieces in a slightly different light. The Chill Air is another title on here, the Chill Air, so here it is, the time of year that the air does get a chill to it. So even though I never, prior to this, for all the years I've had this, had any real Halloween associations with it, I'm thinking that this may end up being one of those, and I never push it, It's just like that Tangerine Dream album, like Green Desert, ended up becoming a Halloween listen to me. And now every time I listen to it, I hear this dark Halloween vibe to it. This album may end up being one of those. I'm definitely going to be listening to it more during this season because I just detected some things listening to it again that I didn't really notice. And it's the dark elements that I didn't notice because they're subtle in the music. And of course, it's the dark elements that give it that Halloween vibe, that autumn vibe, that, the sun's going down early and the moon is out kind of vibe. Definitely of the two Bud and Eno albums, my favorite. So, I didn't realize, when I started filming that I had left a whole batch of CDs of Halloween-themed CDs of things that I always listen to at this time of year in the other room, but I would have been going on for an hour and a half, so I will do that, another video with those on there before Halloween actually strikes. Fingers crossed that this video comes out because I've been talking now for 40 minutes, and thanks for watching. I hope this wasn't a waste of your time. And I will be back with part 2 very soon. And, of course, also getting back to the normal stuff. Hope everybody's doing well. Take it easy.
Tales from the Garage is brought to you by Monster Out. Just spray it once a day throughout your home and keeps all monsters away, even invisible ones. Say goodbye to ghoulies, goblins, gremlins, mummies, vampires, and the living dead. Not effective on witches, chicken men, or rhino girls. And by Smoky brand cigarettes. 9 out of 10 doctors recommend smoky cigarettes to their patients. Remember, gals love a smoky man. Smoky, the key to great taste. Tune in next time for more
Tales from the Garage.